Hi, and welcome to another In Conversation with Dance Mama on our podcast. Now, it's Father's Day, so big happy Father's Day to all of you out there. Of course, we're pre-recording it though, so let's be real. It's not exactly Father's Day today, but when you listen to this, it will be. And I've got a really special guest for us today, Alex Lloyd Hunter, who's a co-founder of a campaign called the Dad Shift. Now, you might be aware of this because it did bump into dance sphere, because last October there was a fantastic moment in their campaign where they strapped baby carriers to different statues, including the one that we all know is in Leicester Square of Jean Kelly, which also caught Patricia Kelly's eye, who, again, some of you will be familiar with as Jean's wife and biographer. So without further ado, I'm going to let Alex just, come in and tell you all about the Dad Shift himself. So Alex, really lovely to meet you.
You too. Thanks for having me.
I was yeah, it's a real treat. So tell us, how did the campaign start?
So the campaign we launched in September 2024, and I've spent my career working in charities and in kind of political campaigns, and I've got a 3-year-old son myself, and I always knew that when I became a parent, I wanted to be a really active, involved dad. I wanted to be a big part of his life, have a close bond with him, and do things as equally as I could with my wife so that she could carry on in her career, which she really loves. And that was really important to me because my father didn't have that. And I remember that very viscerally growing up. He obviously there was no paternity leave when he was when we were born, so he went back to work 9 hours after my brother was born on a Sunday night, and he worked a really long hours in a stressful job. We didn't really see him 5 days a week. He wasn't really involved in looking after us, and he sort of ended up pushed to the periphery of the family. It contributed to the breakdown of his marriage, and we're much closer now as adults. And he's a very soppy, devoted grandfather to my son, and it's given us a way of talking about his experience. And he really feels like he missed out. He really regrets that time. And I think the tragedy is that that is still far too often the experience of men. And the flip side to that is that mums end up having to do everything because fathers are not able to be at home as much as they want to be, not able to take on as much as they might like. And paternity leave is one of the biggest problems in our system that stop people parenting in the way they want to. So I started thinking about setting up a campaign on this. I looked at work that organizations like Pregnant Then Screwed were doing to
Yeah.
bring mums into this. And so I think, well, actually, there's no one mobilizing dads in large number because I know we want this. And it's sort of A, that leaves a hole in the campaign, and B, we need to step up. We shouldn't be leaving this to mums to sort this out for us. Like we benefit from this too. So we are explicitly trying to campaign from the perspective of dads and non-birthing parents. Of course, paternity leave doesn't just apply to
Yeah.
fathers. If you're a mum in a same-sex relationship who doesn't give birth, for example, you get it too. And was put in touch with people who are thinking the same kind of thing at the same time. And so that we launched with this stunt that you mentioned. And the idea behind that was to basically make the point in a sort of fun, hopefully fun, visual way that fathers are often portrayed as their job first, right? They're seen the value you provide to society is your career, what you do at work. Whereas mums are constantly defined first through their family. How many kids do they have? Who's their partner? That comes first, the job comes second. And actually, we wanted to make the point that we need a bit more nuance in how we think about the role men play in society and have space for in a male identity for fatherhood as well as careers. So by strapping these baby slings and babies onto Thierry Henry scoring a goal, or Gene Kelly singing in the rain, or even just members of the public. There's a guy hailing a taxi, and then suddenly he's sort of desperately late for nursery and trying to get there on time. It just makes that point, and people engaged, I think, with the visual stories. They enjoyed that. They found there's a novelty value of like, oh, dad's talking about their babies. Fancy that, which is obviously something we're trying to change. And that gave us a really good platform to build the rest of the campaign on, the attention that we got around that stunt.
Yeah. I mean, I just absolutely, it pops out, and I was so relieved to see this campaign existing, because again, although we're in a niche, I've probably been in this space for about 12 years, because my children are 12 and 8. And how Dance Mama started was basically there wasn't any industry support for women in particular, but birthing parents, in terms of how they re-enter back into the space. The kind of assumption is that you would just sort of leave. So, I find it really important for us to all work together and be allies across the space of the just general umbrella of making parenting and the ability to continue career more equitable. And you've mentioned that already, actually, in terms of how that can really support your wife continuing her career. Just tell us a bit more about that in terms of your sort of mechanics around that, in how you try and make that happen within your own family context.
Sure. So we are lucky that a lot of jigsaw pieces have fallen into place for us. And it was actually through making that all work and doing that kind of puzzle that really hammered home to me just how difficult that is at the moment in this country. So you start with paternity leave. Statutory paternity leave we have is the worst in the whole of Europe. It's 2 weeks paid at less than half a minimum wage. If you're self-employed, like a lot of people in dance, you get absolutely nothing, which again is unusual. Most European countries give self-employed people paternity leave. So I was lucky at the start. I was running my own small company at the time. I set the paternity leave policy. So I got 6 weeks full pay, which I'd love more. That's what we could afford. But it was completely transformative from the beginning to have that extra time. We had challenges, like a lot of new babies. My son didn't feed very well. So we were constantly back and forth to the midwives to try and sort that out. And he also wouldn't go in his cot. So he was sleeping on one of us 24 hours a day. So I was up with him from sort of midnight to 8 a.m.,
Yeah.
sat on my chest watching TV, which was actually lovely in a way. And I just remember after 2 weeks thinking, I just don't know how people go back now.
Yeah.
Like, we weren't ready. It would have been a complete nightmare. So I had that benefit from the start. And then beyond that, we are lucky that we both, I'm self-employed. My wife works for an employer who allows her to work flexibly. So we can both work a bit flexibly. So we can both take on some childcare. And then around that, we have 3 sets of grandparents within half an hour of our house. So they help us out with childcare too. So that helps us with the fact that childcare is extortionately expensive. And all of those boxes have been ticked to make it possible for me to have a day a week with my son where I look after him, and that's our time together. And that also, because I can work from home sometimes, I can do the morning and I can do the evening, like all those things are there. But
Yeah.
for a vast majority of people, those things are really difficult. And
Yeah.
they're all part of a system that pushes you into a relationship where ultimately one parent needs to take on the primary responsibility, because it's not possible for both parents to juggle childcare equally. And
Yeah.
that's almost always the mum. And the paternity leave is the sort of foundational factor that drives that right from the beginning. Because if you have the dad or the other non-birthing parent back after 2 weeks, and the birthing parent takes a full year, and of course they're the one who ends up in the primary parent role, and of course they're the one who takes a step back from their career at the end, because they're already in that role, and that's very hard to shift longer term.
Yeah, and I think it's really important our audiences or new people coming to Dance Mama really hear from Alex and the dad shift, and hear this perspective, because I think the nuance and heightened differences for the dance sector is the wage disparity. So, for example, usually it's low wages. So if you've got a family set up where one of you has more of the stable job, often the dad, that is totally in our scenario the case, that allows for that flexibility around the more artistic job with less pay to happen. But then, of course, absolutely, what sometimes happens, and doesn't always happen with our family because we're a little bit different, but then, like you say, those caring responsibilities go on the mum. But equally for the dads, in this scenario, they're often, like lots of self-employed people you've mentioned, not entitled to any benefits and already on low wages.
Mm.
So we then see kind of these sort of genderized patterns of you then get sort of fathers in leadership roles and artistic directorship roles or chief executive roles, because they are probably not necessarily as proactive as a parent and are managing that because they've got somebody at home doing that for them, their partner or maybe somebody else. But then interestingly, it's harder for me to find stories of dance papas because also their choices around becoming a parent is influenced by their capacity to earn as well as the demands of their job. Another area we've looked at as well, or is a specialism of mine, particularly with my PhD research at the moment, is the physiological changes in women postnatally as professional dancers. But I've always acknowledged the fact that sleep deprivation affects everybody, as you just said. And those factors, when we've spoken to some of the dance papas before, one who's springing to mind most prevalently is Stephen McRae, who's a principal dancer at the Royal Ballet. He talked about having 4 coffees before going into the studio with somebody like Wayne McGregor, who's again going to be quite an intense choreographer, and then falling asleep on the tube on the way home quite regularly after a show and missing his stop. And I'm just, so grateful for this time with you today to really highlight these issues, particularly around paid paternity leave. Tell us a bit more about kind of how badly we compare with other countries and what the best case scenario is, if you know it, in terms of which country is doing the best and what does that look like?
Yes, we compare very badly, is the top line summary. So our paternity leave again is 2 weeks paid at less £187 a week. So that's about about 40% of the minimum wage. It works out to something like a 10 grand a year salary. I mean, it's below the poverty line.
Sorry to interject, but that's the same, isn't it? Statutory maternity.
Statutory maternity, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And as your listeners may know, if you're self-employed and you're taking maternity leave, you only get maternity allowance, which means you get that statutory pay right from the beginning. Whereas if you're employed, you at least get 6 weeks at 90% for the first 6 weeks. So that's another disparity in the system, but really disadvantages self-employed people. And to be clear, across the board, our maternity pay is also very low compared to other
20p
countries.
in a packet of crisps.
Yeah, it's genuinely awful, and they all it's a very badly designed system as a whole, where you have very short poorly paid paternity leave and very long poorly paid maternity leave, and it's almost, you couldn't design a better system to force people into these roles whether or not you want them, right? Because the poor paid maternity leave puts additional pressure on the non-birthing parent to cover the shortfall. You know, the system is designed so that your income falls through the floor at the exact moment your costs rise because babies are expensive. And paternity leave, the pay you get on paternity leave is something like half the cost of an average pram. You know, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
So it's a very poorly designed system. On paternity leave specifically, how we compare: 2 weeks less than half minimum wage. The average across Europe is the equivalent of 8 weeks at full pay. The best you see is, unsurprisingly, in many of the Scandinavian countries. Sweden's system is particularly good. Each parent gets 90 days allocated for that parent at around 80% pay, and then they have 300 days to share between them as they see fit.
Amazing.
Spain is one we look at a lot because 7 or 8 years ago they had the same system as us, 2 weeks, and they have gradually improved it a couple of weeks at a time. So now they get 16 weeks at full pay. And it's been so successful, they're looking to expand it to 20 weeks of full pay. So we really are miles behind other countries, decades behind where other countries in Europe were. And the countries that are a lot less wealthy than us, like Slovakia, has half the GDP per capita, 28 weeks at 75% pay on paternity leave. So other countries are choosing to invest in and prioritize giving families a decent start and making sure that kids get that time to bond with both their parents.
Yeah.
and other countries are recognizing benefits of this, and we have not yet. We need to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, in my own personal scenario, my husband was one of the first people to get paid paternity leave
Mm.
for, I think it was 6 weeks, 8 years ago. Or it was 6 to 8 weeks. So we were able to split that up over the birth of our son. Paul was able to take a few weeks then. Then his brother lives in Australia, and we've got Australian links. So we took the baby and my 4-year-old to Australia
Amazing.
for 6 weeks. That was amazing. That was, yeah, a really really constructive, positive use of that time that we wouldn't normally get. Well, hadn't had probably since we were, students and things like that. And then also my re-entry back into my role, where I'd actually stepped up a gear as head of learning for a dance company called Rombear. I got that role. And again, I think Paul's paid leave really helped here, because I interviewed for that role when Orson was 8 days old and demanded it was a job share and
Nice.
got it, which was the first time in the company's almost 100-year history that had happened. But again, an important piece of the puzzle was Paul had that paid leave and was able to do that. And I think going sort of back to benefits and research around that, anecdotally, we notice the difference in terms of bonding and how our son responds, compared to our daughter, where, because she was timed just before Christmas, Paul was able to get 4 weeks. But again, it's also using holiday, isn't it? Which is not fair. But we do notice there is a slight difference in terms of who they'll go to automatically, when they need something. Love my daughter very much, by the way. But it's interesting to hear the Spanish development, because that's great, isn't it? It's a really good example for, some of our MPs and politicians to actually see that trail's been set in a relatively quickly space of time. That's really heartening to hear. But also in terms of the benefits, have we got any research yet in this country on our benefits? I know there'll probably be stuff from Sweden and Spain, but what's the update on that, Alex?
So we have a lot of evidence on the benefits of good paternity leave. It is pretty much the only advantage of being bottom of the table, as we can see how it's played out in other countries. So there's very clear evidence that better paternity leave is good for mums, it is good for dads and non-birthing parents, and it is good for children. And it's also good for society as a whole, more broadly. So the key benefits are, some of your listeners may have heard the phrase the motherhood penalty. So that is essentially the set of disadvantages in careers and in taking on more domestic work that women face after they have children. And what you see these days is the gender pay gap is pretty minimal until you get to the age at which people start having children, and then it explodes. And about 75% of the gender pay gap now is caused by the motherhood penalty. And paternity leave, as we've talked about, is one of the key drivers in cementing this uneven distribution of how parents of women end up losing out in their careers. So if you look at the evidence across countries with 6 weeks paternity leave or more, is that it brings the gender pay gap down by around 4%. There's a study in Sweden that for every month of parental leave the father took, mother's earnings increased by 7% on average. So there's a very clear relationship between fathers being more involved and mothers having more choice in their career, being able to take on more paid work if they want, and not having to make that sacrifice quite as much. We also have a real problem with discrimination against mothers and women more broadly because of this disparity. And Pregnant and Screwed, most recent research is something like 74,000 women lose their jobs a year simply for getting pregnant. And we know that, you hear something like, I think 1 in 10 company leaders admitted that they wouldn't hire a woman in a certain age bracket because they see them as a baby risk. And of course, if you make it more normal for men to be
A
more involved
baby
in
risk. I
childcare.
love that.
I
A,
know.
a
Exactly.
baby risk.
Baby
Da, da,
risk.
da, da.
Terrifying. But yeah, at the moment, you know that if you hire a man, you don't have that risk. So again, it entrenches discrimination. And what we need to do is make it so that if you hire anyone aged sort of 20 to 40, that there's no perception that, well, because they're a man, that's fine. And because they're a woman, I'm going to lose them for a year. And that's a massive problem. We need to narrow that gap. So that's key benefits for mothers. The other thing as well, that's the long-term kind of structural benefit, but there's a short-term thing. Our system works in a way that increasingly people have C-sections, for example, and you're often told after a C-section, this might take you 6 weeks to recover, and you shouldn't lift anything. You know, if you're not healing quickly, you can't even lift your baby sometimes.
Yeah.
And then your partner is gone after 2 of those weeks. And we hear stories time and time again from people saying, I struggled so much, like heartbreakingly, some stories, and people said, I ripped my stitches because I was left on my own.
Yeah.
And I, you can't just not hold the baby. Or
Yeah.
like I was stuck under the baby for an entire day because I couldn't move because I was
Yeah.
on my own. And it just doesn't add up the way our system works. So that's like the short term benefit is mothers are left alone to
Yeah.
struggle whilst they're recovering from birth. At the moment, they're most at risk of developing postnatal depression as well.
Yeah.
Again, you couldn't design a
Yeah.
worse sort of system and a worse set of timings.
It's a perfect evil scheme.
Yeah.
In that way.
So it's a scheme that's had a complete lack of thought and modernization to reflect how society has changed, right?
Yeah.
So that's mums. For fathers and non-birthing parents, so there's very, very clear evidence that if you're more involved earlier on, you will be more likely to have a stronger relationship with your child longer term, be more involved in looking after them. And that is incredibly good for you and your life. You
Mm.
will end up happier on average. You'll be more productive at work. You're less likely to get divorced. I read a study from the UN that was like you're less likely to abuse drugs. It's just like a really good thing in your life. And I think most fathers who listen to this don't need evidence to tell them that. Like we
Yeah.
want to be more involved. We know how important it is. That for me is the driving motivator. And then finally for children, again, children who have a closer relationship with their fathers, if there is a father in the family, grow up happier, they do better at school, they will become more productive, more well-rounded, happier adults. And there's been a lot of conversation over the last few months about the TV show Adolescence and the importance
Mm.
of fathers being present for young boys in particular. It's a very confusing time to grow up as a young man and try and work out what masculinity means now. It's changed and there are a lot of mixed messages. And we need more than ever fathers to be able to say, this is what a happy, fulfilled life looks like. It's not some of this stuff you might see on the internet. It's not about dominating women or status or money or power. It's about connection and fulfillment. And this is how to be a good, kind of happy member of society. And if you don't have that male role model in your life, then you're much more likely to go down a path that's going to lead to unhappiness for you and others. And then finally, quickly on society and the economy, like the boring stuff, but it matters. It's good for economic growth because
Yeah.
it makes it easier for mothers to take on more paid work if they want. And that helps boost the economy. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation just did a model based on data from other countries that found 6 weeks paternity leave at 90% of pay, which is really the bare minimum we should be moving to next. Generated 2.6 billion pounds of growth and only cost the Treasury a net 200 million pounds. So it's basically for every pound the Treasury is putting in, it's getting 13 pounds back in economic growth, which is pretty much a no-brainer. So it is just, there are tons of benefits. That's why other countries have done this. They recognize that it is just basic economic infrastructure and it's basic way you support families properly and you get back what you invest many, many times over. So we just need to take that plunge as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what has been brilliant about your campaign is it really clearly talks about the financial implications, which often in dance, when we're campaigning for things, we find it hard sometimes to quantify our worth, which is usually at the detriment then of us trying to fly the flag of why dance is important. But it kind of is making me think as well in terms of how important the village is, something we always talk about. in your own circumstances, as you said, you've got family members, primary family members living relatively nearer to you. In terms of dance professionals generally, they've gone somewhere to train, usually another city, probably to have that kind of independence and growth, as most people do when they, leave home. But then what happens is they usually settle around those cities because most of the dance work is in more metropolitan areas. Then when it comes to having a family, they either have to then try and raise their family without their primary family being nearby, or they make the opposite decision of leaving their career or having to make choices around their career to go back towards their primary family. And it's just, interesting those the benefits of all of these things when they operate all together is just better for everyone. And frustratingly for dance folk over here, the language those key decision makers at government usually speak are numbers and figures and statistics, which are usually the bit that we're not so hot on, which is why I was like, oh, where is more research?
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back after this short interlude of reflections about Dance Mama from our community and partners.
Dance Mama for me was literally a lifeline. I'm excited to move my body without holding a human. Like, okay, yes, there's more people doing what I'm doing. Do you mean like it's not just me?
It's meant the world turning up today. It really has. I am going to get emotional.
Sorry.
It's just been so long since I've been in the studio and moving and doing it with a group of other women and not feeling like it's a problem.
The visibility of parents in dance is hugely important because if you can't see it, you don't think you can be it. Everything is planned with the parent and the child in mind.
A whole hour to dance and be creatively expressive and share thoughts together in a creatively expressive way and do something for our bodies and our souls. I mean, amazing.
It's really important for Sadler's Wells to be supporting Dance Mama. Parents working in dance can come together and talk, have peer support and give that opportunity to continue their practice.
It's a sense of reconnecting to actually, oh gosh, yes, I remember. This is what we used to do. This is what we do.
Being a parent takes a village, and being a dancer also takes a village.
So I would just say get involved because this community for me has been really life-changing.
Just some of the pushback we get from particularly perhaps people who are the generation before us, perhaps they're pensioners and they're retired now. And it's really understandable pushback and say, well, we didn't get paternity leave. We were fine. Why does it need to be different now? And I completely understand that response. And I think what it misses is society has changed significantly in around this, and I think in three key ways. So the first is that the roles of men and women have changed. It is much more common now for women to want and to have careers, and that is a really good thing. We go back a generation and you didn't have that much flexibility, even less than we have now, around how you lived your life. Your gender defined that. And so if you're a mother, you were stuck at home. If you were a father, you had to go out and work, and you often missed out on that kind of connection with your family. You go back 2 generations, that were universal. Generation before was starting to change that. Our generation has changed a lot, and I hope it will change more so that people get the control over their own lives. So that's one thing that's changed, and that's a positive change. The second is, as you say, we are living in much more common just to have relatively isolated nuclear families. Yeah. And that's partly because people move around more, as you've talked about. It's also because our culture has changed. People are much less comfortable with just chucking their kids out into the street, and the neighbor over the other side might look after them. Parenting happens much more in the home than it does outside in the community. So people are much less able to access broader support than they were before. And some of the toughest stories I hear from people who really struggled early on for various reasons, whether that was mental health problems or problems with the baby, and they had to go back to work really soon. And it's like, we didn't have any family, we had no family support. And like, that's where you really feel it, when you've just got no outlet to pick up the slack. And that's much more common. And then the third thing is, everything is just really a lot more expensive now. And you go back a couple of generations and it was much more possible to have an average standard of living on one salary. And now that is much, much less possible for most people. And so we have a system that is predicated on the assumption that both parents will work and bring in an income, but also that that you'll be able to look after your children. But if you can't, you put them in childcare, but the childcare costs more than your salary. And it's a system that just creates massive amounts of financial stress on parents and doesn't really work. And you heap on top of that the fact that even just to take your 2 weeks of paternity leave, if you get it, and even self-employed, you obviously get nothing. But if you're on an average salary, it'll cost you over £1,000 just to take those 2 weeks. And then you add on that the poor maternity pay. And so we need a system that, in all those different ways, that keeps up with the reality of how people live now, and make sure that parents are properly supported so that like their children can have a good start in life. Like, that is a fundamental thing that sometimes gets overlooked. And even the link between financial stress, the lack of time off that people get around paternity leave, and mental health problems. We did some research last week that 45% of fathers experience multiple symptoms of postnatal depression in the first year. We did that with Movember. And of course, them going back to work so soon impacts on mother's mental health. And then there's evidence that if your mental health is poor in the first year, your child will have worse life outcomes than if you are healthy. And yet we've locked in a system that makes that more likely to happen. It's just, it feels like a very short-termist perspective that doesn't meet the reality of how you set up families to thrive and create a future of happy, productive kids down the road, which is ultimately what we want as a society.
Yeah. And it's also made me sort of think about, we're part of Maternal Mental Health Alliance, and I don't know if you've connected with them yet, but if you haven't, after this call, I'm doing that. That's going to happen. Because definitely, in terms of the case of our eldest child, with Paul taking those 4 weeks, I was probably one off on the Edinburgh depression scale, I think, when the midwife came round at sort of, in between, before 6-week check, when we used to have those for mums, because that's also something that isn't, happening consistency, is babies getting checked and mum isn't. Definitely post-pandemically, and in terms of the strain on the NHS. But then, having, again, somebody, your other half, birthing parent, whatever they want to call themselves, around, definitely alleviates that, absolutely, in terms of the logistics and the emotional stress. And of course, we focus quite a bit on the financial stress, but of course that has massive emotional repercussions, definitely. In terms of the letters, what I was trying to remember. So basically, I remember there was a story maybe 18 months, a couple of years ago, before we had the current government that we've got, where that previous government had identified that a whole swathe of people who were women in a particular age group were economically inactive. And they decided they would write a letter to those women to encourage them to go back to work. And it's just like, what a complete massive waste of money. Why don't you put that towards some actual childcare? I just think, and again, I guess that's picking up on that generational thing. Of course, you brought up on your social media feed the Piers Morgan comments, just absolute lunacy. That there's, I think, with that generation, and echoed down in dance, there are parallels. It's pain-based. The generation above us have had to endure so much pain that there's this real attitude of, I've had to suffer, so why don't you? Which is the kind of hurt people thing playing out, basically. I've even had it sometimes when I've wanted to interview some people, the generation above me, for Dance Mama, where they've kind of basically said that. And some of those individuals then profess to be the most pioneering in supporting youth talent and progression, etc., but yet won't even talk about that experience themselves, because most of the time they probably either had to pretend they don't have children to carry on their career, or have, done things like, hide their kids in, hotel rooms while they're on at conferences and things like this that's been going on. Whereas, of course, there are other notable members of the generation above who have been generous and given their stories. I think it's really interesting point around that generation. Then in terms of parenting, in terms of my own village, we don't sadly have parents on my husband's side. They passed away a number of years ago, and then my own parents are up in the Midlands and I live down in Surrey, so they're a good 2.5 hours away, and time has ticked on as with me talking 12 years, and they've both now got health difficulties, so they can't come and help me out quite as often. So you're getting this kind of ambiguous grief, aren't you, in terms of seeing people like now, we're seeing each other digitally, but we're not here physically, and our brains are trying to reconcile that. And then the opposite, where we might have people with us who might be a bit distracted on the old screen front and not be present, and trying to reconcile all of that in our modern changing society on top of the adaptations you're making biologically, physically, and emotionally as a parent it's just quite an enormous task. So in terms of sort of policy, because I've seen on your feed as well, obviously there's been some activity at government level with the disparity around different sectors being able to afford different levels of paternity leave or not being able to afford it at all. What's the kind of solution, big question, Alex, that could be presented in terms of policy to really support companies wherever they are on the income and bottom line spectrum to support parental and particularly paternity leave?
Yes, it's a good question, and it is quite a simple answer, actually. So we are pretty clear. We're campaigning for better statutory paternity leave. We think it's really good when businesses offer better leave themselves, but there's a reason we focus on statutory leave rather than going after individual businesses, which is we recognize if you're a small business, a lot of the time it's tough to offer proper amounts of decently paid paternity leave. It's expensive. You might not be able to afford it. And we are seeing this growing two-tier system where bigger companies are recognizing correctly that offering enhanced paternity leave is good for them as a company. And it's good for them because it can help with staff recruitment and retention, but it's also good for productivity and morale. Like your example of dancers having to, drink 4 coffees and then fall asleep afterwards is like a really good example of the complete fantasy of the idea you can go back to work within days, be sleep deprived, your head be completely elsewhere because your life is just turned upside down, and then perform at 100%. I found that hard enough sitting on Zoom calls in an office. I can't imagine what that'd be like leaping around on the stage and trying to, be energetic. I mean, fair play. But companies, I when we offered 6 weeks paternity leave at my company, part of the reason we did that is I was like, I don't want people in front of clients after 2 weeks. There's no way you can be at your best. You need to get the time to be ready before you can be contributing as much as you'd like. So giving people that space is really good for that, and also for making sure that you don't break them, basically, that you have a member of staff in your team who's happy. You don't get them back after 2 weeks and then they have a mental health crisis, which happens far too often. So that's why bigger companies are doing it, but a lot of smaller companies can't. And so that's why we're looking at statutory paternity leave. And particularly as well, we need statutory paternity leave so we can include self-employed people, because obviously they're not going to get that from a company. So the absolute bare minimum we are looking for would be 6 weeks at 90% pay. That's what you get in the first part of maternity leave if you're employed.
Yeah.
Obviously, anything that dads and non-birthing parents are getting should be mirrored in maternity leave or more. We definitely don't think paternity leave should be better for self-employed people or employed people than maternity leave. And crucially, the government, as they do already, should pay the vast majority of that. In fact, if you're a small company, you can claim back something like 108% of your paternity or maternity pay. So you actually get a slight subsidy to pay it out. So this is very much something the government should be doing. And that's how it should stay.
Yeah, I think that's just brilliant. And I think then, obviously, then hopefully with some of the companies being able to do that, you've got some evidence that then hopefully the pressure will be on with the statutory to follow suit. And really, it should be the other way around, isn't it? It should be the government leading by example. And yeah, I mean, just from our sort of corner over here, we're really so grateful that you've taken up the baton with this. It's such an important issue. And I think because of our own personal drivers for doing our campaigns, but particularly on this one, there's a weird crossover because it's something, I've actually experienced and benefited from. So I can certainly wave the flag for you on that. What can listeners or audience members do to follow and support the campaign?
So if you go to dadshift.org.uk, there'll be a button at the top where you can back the campaign, and that's a really good starting point. And we can then follow up with more actions for you to take as the campaign goes along. And if you're on social media, we are at DadShift UK, and just liking, commenting, sharing stuff is really valuable. It means that we reach more people and it helps get the message out. So visit our website, dadshift.org.uk, and follow us on social media at DadShift UK.
Amazing. So finally, just to finish off, because we're having a lovely conversation. What sort of things have you got coming up? Because I know you've been in the news. I know we're pre-recording this, but you've been in the news this week. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, but also what things we can be looking out for?
Yes. So when this comes out on Father's Day, we will have just had the world's first DadStrike, which is happening the Wednesday before Father's Day, so Wednesday the 11th. And in that, we don't know, speak in the future or past tense, we will have got together a bunch of parents across the country to go on a metaphorical strike. So that's either we've got a couple of pickets going in Edinburgh and London outside government buildings, and dads and non-birthing parents and mums and kids are going to come out, and we're having a family-friendly picket where hopefully there'll be things like face painting and fun nursery rhymes and songs and so on, just to make the point that dads are too often and non-birthing parents are too often locked out of being as active parents as we want to be, and we're going to take a little bit of time to go make a point about that. And then at the same time, for those who can't make those pickets across the country, there will be dads doing the school pickup all on the same day, hopefully. And that's because fathers take on that burden often of being the primary breadwinner and miss out on bedtimes, bath times, school pickups. The vast majority of school pickups are done by mums. More than 50% of kids never get picked up by their dads. So just on one day, we're saying, let's go and make a point of doing this, a kind of quiet, gentle protest. So I'm assuming that's gone brilliantly. And hopefully you've already heard about it all over the news. But if you've not, go and check that out. Hopefully it's been interesting.
Well, we'll certainly be supporting that. For sure. And also, can we add you to the mums WhatsApp groups?
Yeah,
because certainly my husband is on our class one, because sometimes that can just be a stream of consciousness. Adds to your mental load, which is always fun.
Ideal.
But yeah, just utterly brilliant. We'll keep looking out. We've made this connection now. We will keep championing at DadShift UK. Just fantastic. And just Alex, just thank you for taking the initiative of pushing this forward. And I really hope at another time in the future when we speak again that those changes, or we've had a nice big shift at some point in statutory support for paternal leave. Forgot my words
Yes.
there again.
I hope so. I'm optimistic. I think we can make some change. It's well overdue.
Yeah, 100%. Alex, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Wow, what a huge thanks to Alex. And I hope some of you may have taken part in June the 11th or indeed follow Alex's work, because we also know as well, in terms of dance and activity during the perinatal period, our partners are really crucial in enabling all of that support to happen. And we're just so grateful to the Dad Shift for really highlighting this, and fingers crossed in the future we get some change. So thanks, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks for being with us and listening to Dance Mama's podcast. Whether this may be your first time considering parenting in dance as a thing, or if you're a parent in dance and this has resonated with you, come on over to the Dance Mama site, that's www.dancemama.org, and see what other ways we are inspiring, informing and connecting people with families in dance, because we help parents in dance move their worlds. Bye for now.